Oberyn Martell stood upon the sandstone balcony in the ancient seat of Sunspear, staring out at the glittering sea. The sun dazzled on the water, and from the high vantage of the prince's tower, the world felt at once serene and immeasurably vast. Soft breezes carried the salt air over the rooftops of the old fortress, mingling with the perfume of warm citrus groves and the spicy aromas drifting up from the courtyard below. Dorne lay before him in all its scorched beauty, a land of blazing skies and scorching deserts, fierce in its independence. All of it was home, and for Oberyn, there was no place on earth he loved more. Yet today, as he stood with his elbows resting on sun-warmed stone, he could not keep his mind from drifting northward, where the Lannisters held sway over King Tommen in the Red Keep, where Tywin Lannister's legacy still cast its long shadow over the realm. Tywin might be dead, struck down by his own son, but the old lion's brood had not been declawed. Cersei Lannister wore her ambitions as a crown of gold, and her children still held power in King's Landing. The memory of Elia Martell's terrible end at the hands of Gregor Clegane, under Lannister orders, never left Oberyn's mind. Sometimes he woke in the night to the imagined screams of his sister, and in the deep hours, he could almost feel the presence of her spirit urging him to bring justice, real justice, for what had been done to her and her children. For years, Oberyn had been a coiled viper waiting to strike. He had tried once in King's Landing, offering himself as Tyrion Lannister's champion, believing that slaying the Mountain in a trial by combat would set the realm aflame with truth. But the fight had gone terribly wrong in the final moments. Though he had inflicted grievous wounds upon Gregor Clegane, Oberyn's thirst for a confession had cost him the victory, and nearly his life. In this new turn of fate, let us say the gods, capricious as they are, had granted him a shred of mercy. That night, after the duel, it was discovered that the Mountain had fallen into a coma from the viper's venom. Oberyn had collapsed from head trauma and blood loss, but against all odds, he'd survived. It took weeks for him to regain consciousness, months of careful healing guided by the best Dornish physicians, and many more months of convalescence. During that time, Princess Arianne, his beloved daughter Tyene, and the rest of his family had gathered close, fearful that Oberyn might die or never regain his old vigor. Yet the Red Viper of Dorne proved too stubborn to yield even to the gods of death. When Oberyn finally woke, the entire realm had changed around him. The War of the Five Kings was spent, but the land lay broken in its aftermath. Joffrey was dead, murdered at his wedding feast. Tywin Lannister had been slain by Tyrion. Tommen Baratheon, the youngest boy, wore the crown but had no real power. Cersei had become Queen Regent, but her hold on the nobility was tenuous. The Tyrells had a strong foothold in King's Landing through Margaery's marriage. Peter Baelish continued his machinations, taking control of the Vale after Lysa Arryn's demise. And the North bled, torn by the Boltons and the betrayal of the Freys. Through all these changes, one factor persisted. House Martell's old thirst for vengeance had not been quenched. Oberyn rose from his bed, thinner than before but no less fiercely determined, and studied the pieces on the board anew. If anything, Tywin's death robbed him of the satisfaction of sinking his fangs into the old lion personally, but the Lannisters were still the ones who had orchestrated or allowed Elia's murder. Her name was never far from Oberyn's lips. In the sleepless hours of the night, her ghost hovered close. "Elia," he would whisper, as if calling her back to see the justice he longed to enact. His burning desire for justice or vengeance, as many would call it, manifested now in the slow drumbeat of his heart. He stared out at the sea as if it might reveal some new path forward. For weeks, he had been receiving small, coded messages from across Westeros, mostly from allies of Dorne and acquaintances scattered through the free cities. But a handful came from sources close to a battered House Tully. The Tullys had suffered greatly. Catelyn Tully was dead, murdered at the Red Wedding. Edmure Tully was a hostage, though at last word, he'd been returned to Riverrun under a Frey garrison's watch after the capitulation of the castle. Brynden Blackfish Tully was rumored to be alive somewhere, in hiding, and the Riverlands had been ravaged. Yet among those battered remains, Oberyn sensed a flicker of the Tully spirit, particularly in the form of the Blackfish. Rumor said the man had slipped away before the castle's surrender and was raising men in secret. Oberyn pondered these tidings deeply. Could the Tullys be a valuable ally in an improbable alliance to bring the Lannisters low? In times past, House Martell and House Tully might have had little to do with each other, for Dorne was distant, and the Tullys were tied to the Starks and Baratheons through marriage alliances. But Oberyn knew that every house in Westeros had cause to resent the iron grip of the Lannisters or the injustices inflicted in King's Landing. If House Martell moved openly against the Iron Throne now, Dorne might stand alone against the might of the Crown, the Tyrells, and whatever other southern alliances Cersei forged. A direct confrontation was unwise. But if Oberyn could sow dissent among the great houses, encourage discontented nobles to defy the crown, and join with disaffected lords, their combined strength might strike a decisive blow. The Tullys, who had once rallied the river lords under their sigil of the Leaping Trout, were natural allies in such a scheme. They, too, had plenty of reason to seek vengeance for the slaughter of the Red Wedding, a slaughter facilitated by Tywin Lannister's cunning. If Oberyn reminded them that the Lannisters had orchestrated the betrayal of Robb Stark and his mother, Catelyn Tully, the seeds of resentment could be harnessed. The Red Viper's mind worked as sharply as a viper's fang. He was not just a warrior but a thinker, a tactician who studied the nuance of politics with a certain relish. People forget, because he was so flamboyant in his fighting style and open in his lusts, that Oberyn Martell was well-educated, cunning, and had spent time in Essos absorbing foreign ideas. He had met mercenaries, warlocks, and even exiled nobles. He had learned the art of negotiation in the courts of Volantis and Lys. If he combined that knowledge with the right alliances, perhaps he might yet achieve his dream, toppling the Lannister hold on the throne and forcing a true reckoning for Elia Martell's murder. A light knock sounded behind him, pulling him from his reverie. Turning, he saw his daughter, Tyene Sand, slipping onto the balcony. She wore the light, flowing silks favored in Dorne, her expression part concern, part curiosity. "Father," she said, "you've been out here all morning. Are you well?" "I'm thinking, my dear," he replied, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I'm always thinking these days. That can be a dangerous pastime, no?" "Only for the Lannisters," Tyene said with a mischievous glint in her eye. "We've heard more news from King's Landing. Cersei is growing bolder. She's removed men loyal to Margaery Tyrell from the City Watch. The Tyrells are sending more gold and grain to curry favor with the crown, but also to ensure King's Landing remains reliant upon them. And it seems certain lords in the Stormlands are none too pleased with the Lannisters' hold on the throne." Oberyn turned back to the sea, though his attention was now focused on Tyene's words. "The lion and the rose do not share power easily. Sooner or later, the crown will slip if it sits on both their heads. That's an opportunity. The Stormlands. That is interesting. The Storm Lords always had a certain rebellious streak. Their true loyalty died with Robert and Stannis, perhaps. What else?" A letter arrived from a fisherman in the Stepstones. He claims that shipments of gold are being ferried to the Narrow Sea, possibly to higher sellswards. But we don't know who's behind that. It might be the Golden Company, it might be one of the Free Cities. We cannot be sure. Oberyn took this in thoughtfully. "Then we'll keep listening." His gaze turned distant, as though scanning some mental horizon. "I want you to draft a letter for me. Several letters, in fact. One to the Prince of Dorne, my brother, of course, and one to a particular ally in the Reach whose name you must keep secret even from the Raven Keepers." "Who?" Tyene asked, although her tone suggested she knew better than to expect a direct answer in plain words. "I'll dictate the letter myself," he said, stepping away from the balcony edge. "And then I want you to discreetly reach out to any known Tully sympathizers. We must find the Blackfish if we can. House Tully is key. They still have rightful claims in the Riverlands, and the small folk there despise the phrase. If the Tully sigil flies again, we may see half the Trident rise in open revolt. For that, we need Brynden Tully or Edmure Tully free. I want to know everything about them. Their whereabouts, who might be smuggling them supplies, who might be open to overtures from Dorne." Tyene listened, her face alight with curiosity and that signature half-smile of the sand snakes. "I'll begin immediately. Is it war, father?" Oberyn's voice went soft. "It's justice, Tyene, or so I hope. Come, let's not keep the quills waiting." They withdrew into the shade of the tower, leaving behind the glare of the sun. Behind them, Dorne simmered under noon's heat. A new thread of the great Westerosi tapestry was being woven, one that would see Oberyn Martell take the initiative in forging alliances that even a year earlier would have seemed unthinkable. Far to the northwest, along the banks of the broad red fork of the Trident, Brynden Blackfish Tully stood on a low wooded hill overlooking a dusty, half-deserted hamlet. He was older now, his hair mostly gray, a lifetime of soldiering etched into every line of his face. He had an angular jaw and eyes that rarely missed a detail. An outlaw band he'd mustered from the remnants of Riverrun's defenders and a few loyal riverlords huddled among the trees. They lacked the numbers to mount any real offensive, but they also knew the terrain intimately. Blackfish had thus far harried passing fry patrols, snatched vital provisions, and otherwise made a nuisance of himself. But his forces were too few to retake Riverrun, let alone the entire Riverlands, which were overrun by Freys, Lannister garrisons, and outlaws. Rumors abounded that young Edmure Tully was a captive in his own castle under a Fry roof. Some said he was to father a child on Rosslyn Fry to secure some twisted claim. Others said he was simply kept as a hostage for good behavior. Brynden loathed the thought of it, but he was not fool enough to assault Riverrun's walls with a handful of men. He had no illusions of rescue missions he couldn't possibly accomplish with his limited resources. Still, every morning he prayed to the Seven, if they even listened anymore, that some miracle might give him a chance. As if answering his prayer, a raven found him that very afternoon. The bird, glossy black, arrived almost unnoticed. One of Brynden's men, a watchful young bowman, fetched the sealed letter from its leg. Brynden recognized the seal immediately, the son and spear of House Martell. That was enough to raise his brow. He retreated to the relative privacy of a secluded glade to read it, perched on a fallen log, the only light a strip of sun filtering through the branches. The words were carefully chosen. They spoke of past injustices done to House Martell and to others. They referenced the cunning of the lion as a destructive force that had unleashed chaos upon many noble houses. And they offered the hand of friendship from Dorne to any true Tully who would fight for justice and the restoration of honor. The letter was signed simply, "O Martell." Brynden read it again and again. He knew Oberyn Martell by reputation, if not personally. The Red Viper was known for his fiery temper and thirst for vengeance against the Lannisters. Rumor was he'd nearly died battling the Mountain. Now, if this letter was to be believed, Oberyn lived and still hungered for retribution. But why reach out to the Tullys? The Martells had their own resources, their own grudges. They hardly needed the Blackfish in all his ragged glory. The letter hinted that House Martell sought to bring about the downfall of the Lannisters and their allies, and needed trustworthy allies across Westeros to do so. A small flame of hope flickered in Brynden's chest. The Tully name had been dragged through mud and blood, from the Red Wedding to the feeble surrender at Riverrun. But it still carried weight among the small folk of the Trident. The Tully sigil was not yet lost, and old loyalties could be awakened if given the right spark. Could Oberyn Martell be that spark? Brynden measured the risks. If he accepted the offer, he'd be forging an alliance with a Prince of Dorne. That much was true. But he'd also be painting an even bigger target on his head. The Freys, the Lannisters, the new crown. They would hunt him as a traitor, an outlaw, a man in rebellion. But in truth, they already did. There was no going back now, no path to a quiet retirement. Brynden Tully had chosen his side when he slipped away from the Freys rather than surrender. He made his decision quickly. Dorne's help was exactly what he needed to create a real resistance. It might not be enough to topple the crown alone, but if rumor was correct, the Tyrells did not fully trust Cersei, the Ironborn were in chaos, and the North was reeling under the Boltons, but there were always rumors of Starks coming back from the grave. If chaos was a ladder, as some said, then perhaps he could climb it. That night, by a guttering torch, Brynden drafted a reply in careful, coded language, accepting Oberyn's invitation to talk further. He indicated that, while he was no friend to hidden conspiracies, he would be eager to meet any emissary from Dorne who could speak plainly of a shared cause. He wrote that House Tully would not rest until the murders of Catelyn Tully and Robb Stark found justice, a cause aligned with House Martell's thirst for retribution for Princess Elia and her children. He sealed it with the imprint of a small fish, a lesser sigil he carried for such secret letters. Then he sent the raven back south, praying it would reach Sunspear unerringly. Weeks passed. Brynden and his band continued to harass Frey forces, but the daily grind of survival weighed heavily on them. Winter would come soon, and though the Dornish climate might remain mild, the Riverlands would turn cold and bleak. They needed arms, supplies, and men if they were to withstand that dreadful season. Fights broke out in the camp between men who wanted to desert and those who still dreamed of recapturing Riverrun. Brynden did his best to keep discipline with a firm hand, but morale was low. If Oberyn's letter was a false hope, Brynden did not know how much longer his little force could hold out. The answer came on a mist-shrouded morning. A pair of riders approached the small glen that Brynden and his men currently occupied. They bore no banners, wore unremarkable cloaks, and arrived with caution. Brynden's sentries halted them at spear point, but one of them held aloft a slender wooden staff carved with Dornish serpents. That alone would have piqued Bryden's curiosity, but then the rider spoke a phrase in the common tongue that had clearly been memorized. The sun rises, the fish leaps. It matched a passphrase in Bryden's note. Aloud into the camp, the riders dismounted. One was tall and lean, a woman with sun-kissed skin and keen brown eyes. The other was younger, a man with a short beard and the confident bearing of a courtier. They introduced themselves as envoys from Dorne, though they did not give real names, only aliases that sounded like minor Dornish courtiers. Yet from the woman's proud stance and the man's carefully chosen words, Brynden sensed they were important, or at least close confidants of Oberyn's. In a makeshift command tent, seated around a rickety table lit by a single lantern, they got to the point. Dorne was prepared to funnel money and weapons to the Tully cause, with the objective of destabilizing the Lannister hold on the crown. Oberyn Martell believed that if the Riverlands rose against the Freys and Lannisters, it could create the spark for other rebellions. Perhaps the Stormlands or even the Vale might join in, if given the right incentives. Prince Oberyn is not naive, the man assured Brynden. He understands that the Lannisters still hold the capital, command the gold mines of the West, and have alliances with the Tyrells. However, the Queen Regent's madness grows. She alienates allies. If the realm sees her falter, perhaps enough disaffected lords will rally to the Tully banner, and to Dorne in spirit. Then together you might force a reckoning. Brynden's jaw tightened as he listened. It was an enormous gamble, but no more than the gamble he made every day by simply existing as an outlaw. "You speak of open war," he said quietly. "War is dangerous. My men are scattered, hungry. We've no illusions of retaking Riverrun alone. We need more than swords. We need knights, lords, the great houses." The woman leaned forward, her eyes glittering in the lantern's light. "We have an advantage now that Tywin is dead. The old lion was the one holding the realm together by fear. Cersei does not command that same dread or respect. Already, the Martells have begun forging secret alliances with certain lords in the Reach who resent the Tyrell stranglehold. Others in the Stormlands and Crownlands might be willing to turn cloak if they see a strong banner rise against the Lannisters. It will not happen in a day or a moon's turn, but the seeds are there. We ask you to tend them with us." Brynden remained silent for a long moment, thinking of Catelyn, of Robb, of the ruin that had befallen his house. He thought of Edmure, imprisoned and forced to serve as a brood stall for the Freys, and of the everyday suffering of the small folk under the Freys' tyranny. At last he exhaled. "Tell Oberyn Martell I am with him. House Tully stands with House Martell to bring down the Lannisters. He has my word, but I will need proof of your support. Grain, coin, steel. Enough to sustain us through the winter and beyond." "You shall have it," the man replied with a grim smile. "Dorne is not lacking in gold, and Prince Oberyn has friends across the sea. in the free cities who can ship supplies. He only asks that when the time comes, you raise the Tully banner and declare yourself openly. Let all the Riverlands know that Brynden Tully has returned." "Agreed," Brynden said, though he felt a quiver inside. Declaring open rebellion was signing his own death warrant if they failed. But for too long had House Tully lived in the shadow of Frye betrayal. Someone had to lead, or the Tully name would die in obscurity. That very night, an agreement was drafted in coded words. Brynden's men soon found themselves with new tasks: forging hidden supply routes, contacting sympathetic lords in the region, and building caches of arms. Regular shipments began arriving under cover of darkness. Crates of dried fruit, grain, spears, swords, and crossbow bolts, along with casks of Dornish wine that raised many a soldier's spirits. It was hardly an AR. But it was a lifeline. Morale soared. Men deserted less often. Deserters even returned, lured by the promise that House Tully was not finished. In return, Brynden quietly sent word through secret channels to his old allies, the Lannisters of Seaguard, the Blackwoods, and others who had once stood with the Riverlords under King Robb Stark. He found more success than he dared hope. The Freys were widely despised, and many lords still seethed over the Red Wedding's treachery. They feared direct confrontation, but if House Martell was behind a new alliance, perhaps the cause was not lost. In Sunspear, Oberyn received the news of Brynden's success with grim satisfaction. He listened to his envoy's reports carefully, cross-checking them with information from other sources. So far, House Martell's involvement remained discreet. Officially, Prince Doran Martell, Oberyn's elder brother, had not declared war. Dorne still maintained a public face of peace with the Iron Throne, acknowledging Tommen as king. But in shadowy corners, Oberyn waged a private campaign. He was careful not to let it leak too widely. If Cersei caught wind of it, she might try to bring the full wrath of the crown, or manipulate the Tyrells to take up arms against Dorne. Not yet, Oberyn told himself. Not until we're ready. Time drifted on, measured in deliveries of arms, coded letters, and the slow but steady growth of a hidden rebellion. Through it all, Oberyn felt the restless fire in his veins. Sometimes he would prowl the gardens of Sunspear, recalling his near-fatal duel with the Mountain. Now, rumor said, Gregor Clegane was a husk of a man, turned into some monstrous Kingsguard sworn to Cersei. Others said he had died. The truth was as murky as the waters of the Blackwater Rush, but Oberyn found himself less fixated on the Mountain himself and more on the entire Lannister edifice. If it was not the Mountain, it would be another Lannister lackey. The real serpent's head lay in the Red Keep, perched on that hateful iron seat. During one of these restless nights, Oberyn received a visitor he had not expected, Elia Sand, his longtime paramour, mother to several of his daughters. She approached him in the quiet hush of the gardens, moonlight illuminating her delicate features. Her brow was creased with worry. Oberyn had avoided speaking too directly to her about his conspiracies, not for lack of trust, but to keep her safe from the uglier side of his plots. Yet Elia was no fool. "Oberyn," she said softly, coming to rest a gentle hand on his arm. "You've been carrying this anger for so long. I know Elia was dear to you. She was dear to Doran, to all of Dorne. But we cannot bring her back by drowning the realm in blood." He gazed at her, the lines of his face hardening. "You think I do this only for Elia? She is a large part of it, yes, but not the only reason. The Lannisters have inflicted suffering everywhere. The Tullys were betrayed, the Starks slaughtered, the realm cast into chaos. Justice is more than personal revenge. This is about forging a new order where the likes of Tywin Lannister cannot butcher children in the name of the crown." Elaria's eyes glistened. "You are a good man, Oberyn, but sometimes good men become monsters when they stare too long into vengeance. Promise me you will not lose yourself in this. Promise me that you will see a future for Dorne, for your daughters, for all of us." He softened, placing a hand over hers. "I cannot promise that the path ahead won't be dark, but I do promise that I will not forget you, or our daughters, or the peaceful dawn that might come after. I want to see a realm where no one suffers as Elia did. That is my dream." Elia nodded, a single tear escaping down her cheek. In the moonlight, the two lovers stood briefly entwined, a fragile moment of tenderness in the midst of swirling plots and looming war. Word spread in subtle ways that the Tully name was stirring again. In the riverlands, in the taverns and along the roads, travelers whispered of black fish sigils seen on ragtag patrols that ambushed Fry outriders. They spoke of small folk disappearing at night to join hidden camps in the forests. The phrase responded by increasing the harshness of their rule, sending more patrols, punishing villages suspected of harboring Tully rebels. This only inflamed the small folks' hatred. The more the phrase cracked down, the more new recruits found their way to Bryndon's band. Cersei Lannister, in her seat of power in King's Landing, heard these rumors too. But the crown was preoccupied with other threats. The growing frustrations with the Iron Bank, the rumors of dragons across the Narrow Sea, the uneasy alliance with the Tyrells, and 1,000 other intrigues. To the Queen Regent, the notion that Brynden Tully might raise a real rebellion seemed laughable. The phrase had the situation in hand, so she was told, and if the Tullys squeaked, the crown needed only to remind them that Tommen was their king, rightful and beloved by the Seven. If that failed, the Lannisters could send a punitive force of knights from the Westerlands to crush any trouble in the Riverlands. So, for a time, Cersei's gaze looked elsewhere, focusing on eliminating her rivals at court. She did not suspect that Dorne was pulling threads behind the scenes. She expected Dorne to remain quiet, bound by the arranged betrothal of Prince Trystane Martell to Myrcella Baratheon. She told herself that, with Myrcella in Sunspear, the Martells would be too timid to rebel openly. But in truth, Dorne had grown tired of the Lannisters' manipulations. Under the watchful eye of Prince Doran, who had his own long-standing plans of vengeance, Oberyn's more immediate conspiracies found cautious support. Doran Martell had not always approved of Oberyn's boldness, but now, with Tywin gone, the moment seemed ripe. "Be careful," Prince Doran told his younger brother in private conversation, "but do what needs to be done. When the time is right, Dorne will stand behind you." Thus encouraged, Oberyn pressed on. In addition to aiding Brynden Tully, he quietly reached out to certain Stormlords who remembered the old days under House Baratheon. Names like Tarth, Estermont, and Penrose came up in letters. Many of these lords were nominally loyal to Tommen but had grown wary of Lannister overreach. If an opportunity presented itself to unseat Cersei's court, they might consider rising in open defiance. Oberyn also sent discreet feelers to the Vale, though Peter Baelish's hold there was murky. It was rumored the Lords Declarant and young Robert Arryn were under Baelish's sway. Yet Oberyn suspected Baelish was too self-interested to join a cause that did not directly benefit him. Still, knowledge was power, and the Red Viper wanted knowledge of every potential ally or enemy. In the darkness of Riverrun's great hall, Edmure Tully sat by the cold hearth, a battered man, his spirit weighed by defeat. He had lost so much. His sister, his king, his castle, and most of his pride. The phrase kept him alive in some semblance of comfort. He was allowed to move freely within the walls of Riverrun, but never to leave. Guarded day and night by dour-faced Fry men-at-arms, Edmure found his days melding together into a fog of regret. He had tried to do what was best for his family, yet everything had gone wrong. One evening, as he was retiring to his chamber, a hooded servant slipped him a small piece of parchment in the corridor. Edmure's heart leapt into his throat, for such things were dangerous. He kept his composure, tucking the parchment into his sleeve without a word. Later that night, by the flickering light of a candle, he read it. There, in a script he recognized, were the words, "Brother, do not despair. There is hope. Oberyn Martell extends his hand. The fish shall leap again. Hold fast. B." The note bore Bryndon's fish symbol. Edmure closed his eyes, tears pricking at their corners. Brynden was alive, and apparently forging alliances with Dorne. In that moment, Edmure felt a spark reignite in his chest. Perhaps he was a captive now, but if Brynden had found a way to keep the Tully name alive, then Edmure was not entirely defeated. If the day came that rebellion flared in the Riverlands, maybe Edmure could open Riverrun's gates from within, or undermine the Fry garrison somehow. He memorized the note, then carefully burned it over the candle flame, turning it to ash. The act felt strangely liberating, as if he was symbolically burning away his despair. He would not give the phrase the satisfaction of seeing him broken. Quietly, Edmure began to watch and listen. He discovered that even among the castle servants, there were those who had once served House Tully with devotion, men and women who chafed under the Frye occupiers. He confided in a few carefully, never speaking openly of rebellion but letting them know House Tully was not dead. More than once, he overheard Frye men-at-arms complaining about missing shipments, ambushed on the roads. Brynden, no doubt about it. The Blackfish was out there, harassing them in the name of Tully honor. Edmure found renewed determination, telling himself he must be ready when the time came. As the seasons advanced, the nights grew longer. In Sunspear, the heat of summer lingered longer than in the rest of Westeros, but Oberyn knew winter was creeping inexorably closer. He and his co-conspirators had to set a timetable. There was no advantage in letting the realm slip further into chaos without striking. The Tully cause gained momentum, but if they waited too long, the might of the crown or an alliance with the Tyrells could stomp them out. Over cups of spiced wine, Oberyn and Doran would speak in low, private voices about the next steps. One plan stood out among many. The Tully forces, stealthily bolstered by Dornish gold and arms, would seize Riverrun at a critical moment when Frye forces were weakened or distracted. That would be the official banner-raising of the rebellion, the signal to all of Westeros that House Tully had returned in force and defied the crown. If that happened successfully, Oberyn believed a cascade of events might follow. Other houses once loyal to the Tullys or the Starks might join them. The Stormlands might stir. Possibly even the Reach Lords who disliked Cersei would begin to distance themselves from the crown. In short, the Lannisters' grip might falter enough for a decisive strike. But for that, Brynden needed more men and a plan to breach Riverrun. So Oberyn hatched another scheme. A band of elite Dornish warriors could slip into the Riverlands, disguised as merchants or sellswords, linking up with Brynden's rebels to coordinate the assault on Riverrun. The difficulty was moving such forces without tipping off the crown. Nevertheless, Dorne had many experienced men who had traveled the trade routes all their lives. It was a risk worth taking. In the dead of night, a company of about 50 Dornish men and women, handpicked by Oberyn and led by one of his most trusted captains, set sail from Sunspear on a modest merchant vessel. They carried with them crates of dried fruits and spices, which concealed arms and armor. If all went well, they would dock in the Stormlands, meet a local contact, and then travel by land through the Rainwood and the Kingswood, eventually slipping into the Riverlands. The journey would be fraught with peril. Royal patrols might spot them. The roads were rife with outlaws. But if they succeeded, it would be the first significant foreign military presence in the Riverlands since the War of the Five Kings. And it would be a silent dagger pointed at the Frey's back. At the same time, Oberyn sent additional letters to Brynden, urging him to be ready to move quickly once the Dornish warriors arrived. He also tasked them both with finding a way to free Edmure from inside Riverrun, if at all possible. Edmure's presence at the recapture of the castle would signal the legitimacy of the Tully cause. Brynden agreed. He was still wary of risking everything on a single bold stroke, but as the Blackfish, he knew that fortune often favored the bold in these uncertain times. On a bitterly cold morning, weeks later, the small Dornish contingent managed to reach the outskirts of the Riverlands. Their route had indeed proven dangerous. They had lost a few men to outlaw attacks, and some gold had been spent bribing certain toll keepers in the Crownlands. But at last they arrived at a predetermined rendezvous in a rocky glen near the border, where a group of Brynden's men waited. After tense moments of mutual identification, they joined forces. The Dornish captain, a lean man with a wiry beard and practiced eyes, shared Oberyn's instructions with Brynden. That night, they gathered around a modest fire and planned the assault. Brynden's scouts reported that the Frye garrison at Riverrun was smaller than it had been, because Walder Frye had recalled some troops to the Twins. He likely needed them for his own internal power struggles. Some of the men left behind were green recruits or older veterans, not the best the Freys had to offer. A perfect opportunity if they moved swiftly. The plan formed. They would approach Riverrun under cover of darkness, staging a diversion along the main road to draw out part of the garrison, while a second force slipped through a rarely used sally port near the Watergate. Ideally, Edmure, once alerted, would help sow confusion within the castle. If all went well, the Tully banner would fly on the ramparts before dawn. The Freys might still hold the rest of the Riverlands, but losing Riverrun would be a huge symbolic blow, and a tangible one. Brynden Tully would be once more the rightful castellan of his house seat. That was the moment they would openly declare for war against the Lannisters and the Freys. So it was that, under the moon's silver gaze, a ragtag army of Tully loyalists and Dornish warriors crept through the woods toward Riverrun. The castle stood on its great triangular spur of land, two sides protected by rivers, its walls stout and well-guarded. Brynden's heart clenched as he beheld his family home from afar. Pained him to see it under the Frey banner. But soon, if the gods were kind, that abomination would end. Just before midnight, a group of Tully rebels lit torches and approached the gate on the main road, feigning a drunken rabble returning from a raid. They set up a raucous noise, drawing the attention of the Frey guards atop the battlements. Shouts rang out. Crossbow bolts whistled. Several men in the rabble fell, and the rest scattered, but not before they launched flaming arrows into the air, creating a spectacle and a threat that more Tully men might be massing outside. As Brynden had hoped, the Frey commander sent out a portion of his garrison to chase off or capture the intruders, leaving fewer men inside. Meanwhile, a second group led by Brynden himself, accompanied by the Dornish captain, crept along the embankment of the river. The Watergate, though locked and guarded, was not as heavily watched at this late hour. A pair of rebels with grappling hooks scaled the slick stone, dispatching the two sleepy guards in quick, silent strokes of steel. Then they unlocked the gate from inside. The water lapped softly against the stone, masking the soft clink of armor. One by one, the Tully Dornish force slipped inside. The interior courtyard was dimly lit by torches. A handful of Frey guards patrolled lazily, expecting no trouble from within. They were taken by surprise as Brynden's men fanned out, silencing them before an alarm could be raised. With uncanny speed, they spread through the castle corridors, heading for key choke points: the main gate controls, the guard barracks, and the keep where Edmure was kept. Edmure, for his part, had been waiting. A Tully serving maid had smuggled him a dagger. He could do little against an entire guard detail, but he waited in the darkness of his chamber, heart pounding. When he heard muffled cries and the clang of steel in the corridor, he knew the moment had come. Summoning the courage he feared he had lost, Edmure flung open his door. One startled Frey guard raised his spear. Edmure lunged, burying his dagger under the guard's armpit. They tumbled to the floor in a struggle, but Edmure's desperation gave him an edge. He silenced the man, then wrested the spear from his grip. His heart hammered, sweat running down his face. "Edmure!" came a whispered call from farther down the corridor. The tall figure of Brynden Tully appeared, wearing leather armor and a half-helm, sword in hand, face lit by the torchlight. "Thank the gods you're alive, Uncle," Edmure managed, tears in his eyes, though he tried to keep his voice low. They embraced swiftly before moving on. Brynden handed Edmure a short sword. "We have the advantage of surprise. The castle will be ours soon if we move quickly. Are you ready?" "More than ready," Edmure said, swallowing his fear. Together, they fought their way through a group of bewildered Frey guards near the main stairwell. The clash of steel and the echoes of shouted orders resounded through the corridors. The Dornish warriors, silent and lethal, struck from the shadows, cutting down Freys who were still trying to don armor. Soon, the courtyard rang with the cries of men. Those Freys who had not been dispatched in their beds rallied to defend the main gate, but the Tullus had seized the mechanism that controlled the portcullis. The outer gate was locked, preventing the Frey patrol that had ventured outside from returning. Within the hour, resistance collapsed. The remnants of the Frey garrison either surrendered or were cut down. Brynden himself strode onto the ramparts with a Tully banner, which he raised high. Across the cold water, under the moon and stars, that red trout on a field of blue and red rippled in the night breeze. A ragged cheer rose from the Tully men in the courtyard. Riverrun was Tully once more. By sunrise, the Fry patrol that had been sent out in pursuit of the diversion returned, only to see the Tully banner flying over the walls. Leaderless and outnumbered, many of them threw down their arms. A few tried to flee, but Bryndon's scouts hunted them down, ensuring no immediate alarm would travel to the twins. The capture of Riverrun was stunningly swift, and so neatly done that the rest of the Fry forces in the area were caught unawares. The Blackfish wasted no time in reorganizing the castle's defenses, ensuring that the gates and walls were manned by loyal men. Edmure, though somewhat shaken by the violence of the night, stood proudly beside his uncle in the great hall, greeting old retainers who had been forced to serve the Freys. They knelt in gratitude, weeping to see House Tully restored. The news spread like wildfire across the surrounding villages. By noon, crowds of small folk were gathering near the castle gates, cheering the return of their rightful lord. Almost immediately, Brynden dispatched fast riders to the Lannisters, Blackwoods, Brackens, Vancess, and other local houses that had once followed the Tully banner. He invited them to come witness the restoration of Riverrun's rightful lords, and to lend their support in the new struggle that was to come. Dornish riders joined them, traveling farther to sow the seeds of open rebellion. Now that Riverrun was reclaimed, there would be no going back. The Tullys had declared themselves openly against the Freys and, by extension, the crown that had endorsed the Red Wedding. War was inevitable. The next step was to proclaim their alliance with House Martell. That same day, in Riverrun's Great Hall, a small ceremony was held. The Dornish captain, who now revealed himself as a knight by the nom of Ser Miles Santagar, vassal to House Martell, stood with Brynden and Edmure Tully. Before a small assembly of Tully retainers and loyal knights, Ser Miles removed his helmet and spoke words of fealty. In the name of Prince Oberyn Martell, I pledge the support of Dorne to House Tully in our shared quest to restore justice in the realm. We stand together against those who have abused the realm's trust and shed innocent blood. Brynden and Edmure replied in kind. A hush fell over those gathered. Most had never dreamed they would see Dorne and the Riverlands aligned in such a way. The boldness of it was staggering. Once the hush broke, murmurs swept through the onlookers, a mixture of hope, awe, and trepidation. This was more than just a local uprising. This was a direct challenge to the Lannisters and the Freys, one that might spark a wider war. The Tully men looked at each other, then at Brynden. If he felt fear, he did not show it. He only felt a fierce, unyielding pride that the Tully trout once more swam free. In the days that followed, the response from the local lords was cautiously supportive. A letter arrived from Lady Sibel of House Vance, pledging a contingent of men. Lord Jason Mallister responded with guarded encouragement, stating he would prepare his levies if the Tully cause seemed likely to succeed. The Blackwoods, who had always feuded with the Brackens, were quick to send 50 archers. The Brackens did not respond immediately, uncertain whether to trust a Tully rebellion. But more and more small folk arrived at Riverrun's gates, seeking to join the ranks or at least find protection under Tully rule. Brynden realized they would need more supplies, more coin, more everything. But the first wave of wagons from Dorne arrived soon after, bringing casks of food and crates of new arms. Day by day, a spark of renewed hope spread across the region. At the Twins, old Walder Frey exploded in fury upon hearing the news that Riverrun had fallen to the Tullys and that Dorne was supporting them. He spat curses, railing against incompetent sons and grandsons who had let this happen. He demanded immediate retribution. But with large parts of his house scattered or managing other holdings, he could not muster a response overnight. Riders were sent to King's Landing, begging for help from the crown. The Lannisters, the Freys insisted, had an obligation to quell this Tully rebellion. Walder Frey frothed at the mouth, remembering the day he had stood by, with Tywin Lannister's blessing, and butchered his guests at a wedding. Now that same cunning was turned against him in a stealthy surprise. The old man seethed and vowed that every Tully would die for this insult. The The Lannister response in King's Landing was complicated. Cersei initially dismissed the threat, believing that a single castle changing hands was no crisis. But soon more reports reached her. Tully banners flying, lords rallying, Dornish gold fueling the rebellion. The crown's purse was stretched thin. She might have to rely on the Tyrells for additional funds. But Marjorie's faction was not swift to open the coffers. Tension flared in the Red Keep. The Queen Regent flew into rages, threatened to send the royal army to crush Riverrun, and demanded that Kevan Lannister mobilize forces in the west. Kevan, more cautious, advised that they needed to confirm the extent of Martell involvement before marching. If this was indeed orchestrated by Dorne, it could be a prelude to a larger Dornish invasion. He recommended forging alliances or offering bribes to border lords to block Dornish passage. But the heart of it was that the Tullys had dared to raise their banner against the crown. If others followed, the realm could descend into war again. Thus, the opening gambit in the alliance between Oberyn Martell and House Tully proved successful. Riverrun was free, the Tully name was resurgent, and the Freys and Lannisters found themselves on the back foot. Letters raced from castle to castle, ravens filling the skies. Battle lines began to form. Winter's chill deepened, but so, too, did the fires of rebellion. At the heart of it stood Oberyn Martell in Sunspear, a viper who had learned to coil in the shadows. He knew the hardest battles lay ahead, for the Lannisters were not yet beaten, and Cersei's capacity for vengeance was legendary. But Oberyn felt Elia's spirit close, whispering for him to strike true, and so he would. The Red Viper had found a trout to join him, and together, they planned to tear out the lion's throat. Yet even Oberyn, cunning as he was, could not predict how the rest of Westeros might respond. Far off in the north, rumors spoke of dark omens and Bolton cruelty. Across the sea, whispers of a Targaryen girl with dragons drifted westward. In the Vale, the boy lord was a puppet dancing on Peter Baelish's strings. And in the Reach, a proud new generation of Tyrells might decide that a weakened Lannister monarchy was ripe for their own designs. Still, as Oberyn gazed out at the Dornish sea once more, he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. A war for true justice, for vengeance, and for a new order was at hand. He savored it, feeling the old excitement stir in his blood. If House Tully and House Martell could stand as one, perhaps the entire realm would remember a lesson it had forgotten. To kill a viper might be easy if you crush it under heel, but let it slip away, let it find allies, and you might discover its bite is more lethal than ever. And Oberyn Martell, the Red Viper of Dorne, had only just begun to bare his fangs. Across the wide expanse of Westeros, ravens flew with the news that Riverrun had fallen back into Tully hands. To some, it was little more than a curious footnote of local warfare. To others, it heralded the start of a new and dangerous rebellion. In a realm still scarred by the War of the Five Kings, many lords grew wary at the first hints of fresh conflict. Soldiers who had just returned to their fields and families now sharpened blades once more, uncertain whether they might be summoned to march under a banner they neither loved nor hated enough to die for. And in certain corners, the bold and ambitious watched the stirring in the Riverlands with sharp interest, wondering how best to position themselves. In the Red Keep, Queen Regent Cersei Lannister seethed. She paced her private chambers, dressed in black velvet, a golden lion pin at her shoulder. Her pale hands curled into fists when she read the reports from the Freys. The nerve of those fish to dream they could tear down the foundations the Lannisters had built. Of course, Cersei had half a mind to let the Freys handle the business themselves. After all, it was they who had sworn to keep the Tully seat in check. But Walder Frey's message was clear. His forces alone would not be sufficient to retake Riverrun if the Tullys were being fed gold and arms by Dorne. "Your Grace," said Qyburn, bowing low as he entered her chamber, "I have further tidings. It seems that Prince Oberyn Martell, who was long rumored to be recovering from his injuries, now moves openly behind this alliance. Or at least, the Dornish paramilitary assistance reported in the Riverlands comes with the Sun and Spear. It is no mere rumor. The Freys demand a royal army to quell the revolt." Cersei turned to stare at him, eyes bright with fury. "They can demand all they like. Where am I to conjure a royal army from, pray tell? The crown is not flush with gold, and the Tyrells. Here her voice took on an acid edge. They will not open their coffers out of love for me or my son. They expect something in return. She went to the window, looking out over the sprawling city of King's Landing. So many squalid rooftops, so many hungry mouths. Supplying an expeditionary force for a distant war would not be popular, especially if it meant raising new taxes. The memory of her father's iron-handed efficiency made her grit her teeth. If Tywin were alive, he would have crushed this flicker of rebellion before it could spark a blaze. But Tywin Lannister was gone, and in his place stood Cersei, struggling to command the same respect. "Your Grace," Qyburn ventured carefully, "the Tyrells might be convinced to help if we bind them closer, perhaps a new betrothal or a lucrative trade arrangement that benefits Highgarden. We could also lean on the loyalty of House Lannister's bannermen in the west. The gold mines near Casterly Rock may be dwindling, but you still have enough resources to mount a punitive expedition if you consolidate." Cersei's expression twisted. "Kevin insists we tread carefully, that we gather our strength. By the time we do that, the Tullys and Martells might have rallied half the realm. No, we must strike, but we must do it strategically. Lord Frey will have to hold the line until I am ready. He started this mess by letting Riverrun slip through his fingers." "Indeed, Your Grace," Qyburn said, bowing again. "Shall I send word that the Crown will provide support once forces are assembled?" "Yes, and draft a command for a special envoy to the Westerlands. I want my Uncle Kevin to begin mustering a force. Let him bark at the Lannister bannermen until they remember their duty to our house. I will not see the Tully trout dancing in the Riverlands without a swift and crushing response." Qyburn departed, leaving Cersei to brood. She toyed with the idea of unleashing Gregor Clegane, Ser Robert Strong as he was now called, upon the Riverlands. That monster of hers, unholy as he might be, was a powerful deterrent. But would it be wise to send him so far from King's Landing? Cersei had enemies enough in the capital, from Marjorie Tyrell's subtle manipulations to the stony disapproval of the faith. She did not relish leaving herself unprotected. Still, if the Tullys had turned the Martells to their cause, then war was upon them. Cersei felt the old anger rise at the very name Martell. She still remembered Oberyn's sneer when he demanded justice for Elia. The memory of him in the arena, dancing around the mountain, haunted her nightmares. He had nearly killed Gregor that day. Cersei had no illusions that Oberyn's thirst for vengeance had waned. She pressed her lips together in a thin line. Let him come. She would see him pay for this impertinence, for defying the crown. In the days that followed, Walder Frey received a carefully worded royal missive stating that the crown would assist in crushing the so-called Tully uprising, but that Frey resources must first be mobilized to contain the threat. Walder cursed and spat. He demanded that his sons gather every man they could muster. If he did not drive Brynden Tully back out of Riverrun, his own house might be seen as powerless. And Walder Frey was not a man who tolerated insults to his power. Meanwhile, in the seat of the Tullys, preparations for a larger campaign continued apace. Brynden Tully and Edmure Tully had begun reorganizing Riverrun's garrison, welcoming small groups of troops sent by supportive riverlords. The days were chilly, the nights colder still, but the mood was hopeful. The black fish sigil flew beside the sun and spear in the courtyard, a sign of the alliance that had made all this possible. Edmure, who had grown leaner and harder in captivity, found renewed purpose in overseeing the refurbishment of the castle's defenses. He stood on the battlements with his uncle, watching a group of laborers reinforce the wooden hoardings. "I never imagined we'd see the day when Dornish men stood guard here," Edmure said, gesturing to the sentries. They wore light leather in the Dornish style, some of them armed with spears and curved blades. "It's odd, is it not?" Brynden nodded. "Odd, but necessary. We owe Oberyn Martell our thanks. Without Dornish gold, we'd still be out in the wilderness. But I'd be lying if I said this alliance doesn't make me uneasy. The Martells have their own objectives, vengeance for Elia, a chance to strike at House Lannister. That suits us for the moment, but alliances born of hatred can be fickle if the goals diverge. For now, though, we share the same enemy. Edmure looked out over the red and brown fields. We do, and the Freys are sure to retaliate. We must be ready. Have we heard from any more houses? Brynden exhaled, his breath misting in the cold air. Yes, ravens came this morning. The Blackwoods have pledged another 50 men. House Mallister says they're assembling a company of archers. The Vancess likewise. The Brackens remain silent, but I suspect they're waiting to see if we can hold Riverrun. Typical Brackens, always sniffing the wind before they commit. We'll see. Below them, Dornish captains trained new recruits in the courtyard, drilling them in spear formations. Brynden watched them for a moment, remembering his own youth when he had roamed the Seven Kingdoms as a knight-errant. He had never pictured a day when the Martells would openly support the Tullys. But war made strange bedfellows, and Tywin Lannister's machinations had sown enough seeds of resentment to sprout alliances across half the realm. On the far side of the yard, Ser Miles Santagar emerged from the armory, his bearded face set in a focused expression. He spotted Brynden and Edmure, nodded, and approached. "My lords," he said, offering a short bow. "The shipments from Dorne are arriving more regularly now. Prince Oberyn sends word that he has arranged safe passage through certain friendly ports in the Stormlands. As winter sets in, the sea passages grow tricky, but we remain committed." "That is good news," Brynden said. "We'll need those supplies if we're to hold this castle through the cold months. Have you any word from Sunspear beyond that?" Ser Miles hesitated. "Prince Oberyn urges us to be vigilant. He has received intelligence that the Lannisters will soon muster a western host. They may march east to join with Frey forces, then strike at Riverrun. Prince Oberyn suggests that if we can intercept or delay the western host, it might buy us time to fortify and also rally more support in the Riverlands. If the Lannisters are allowed a swift march, we could be overwhelmed before winter loosens its grip." Edmure swallowed, recalling the last time a Lannister host marched through the Riverlands. The devastation had been immense. "We must plan for that. Perhaps we can harass them as they cross the Red Fork. Ambush their foraging parties." Brynden's eyes glinted with determination. "We know this terrain better than they do. Let them come. We'll bleed them every step of the way. And if they try to encircle Riverrun, they'll find we have our own outriders ready to cut their supply lines." The months rolled on, and winter clawed its way down from the north. The nights became brutally cold, even in the more temperate Riverlands. Snow fell intermittently, turning roads to slush. Ravens carried the news of fresh horrors in the north, with rumors that Jon Snow had been killed at the Wall, then inexplicably returned, or that the wildlings were on the move. The details were hazy, but they did little to comfort the common folk. All across Westeros, men looked to their lords and wondered if another war was truly about to unfold in the midst of gathering snows. Cersei Lannister, despite her initial reluctance to gather an army, soon found herself under growing pressure from Walder Frey and her own advisors. Kevan Lannister was not a man of idle threats. He quietly assembled a force of loyal bannermen in the Westerlands. Lords Brax, Crakehall, and Marbrand each began calling their men to arms. The crown offered some support, though gold was tight. Kevan did his best to cajole wealthier lords into contributing to a short campaign that would restore order to the Trident. Yet even within the Westerlands, there were murmurs of discontent. Tywin Lannister's iron-fisted control had disappeared with his death, replaced by Cersei's erratic governance. Some bannermen remembered the days when House Rayne had tried to defy the Lannisters, only to be crushed. They wondered if a similar fate might befall them if they marched to fight in a war that served primarily the Queen Regent's pride. A few minor houses even maintained covert contact with Dorne, though carefully hidden. In Sunspear, Oberyn Martell felt the tension of the realm in every breath. He stood at a carved wooden table in a chamber overlooking the sea, where a large map of Westeros lay spread out. Colored pins dotted the map, marking the positions of friends, foes, and unknowns. Nearby, Tyene Sand assisted him by reading fresh reports from coded letters. Occasionally, Oberyn would pause to gaze at the horizon, recalling that day in King's Landing when he had nearly died. The sting of that memory never fully left him. "We are nearing the point of no return," he said quietly to Tyene, tapping a spot on the map near the border of the Riverlands and the Westerlands. "The Lannisters will soon commit their main host, if rumors hold true. The question is whether the Tyrells will lend them significant aid. Mace Tyrell is not known for his cunning, but Olenna Tyrell is no fool. We must watch the Reach carefully. If the Tyrells smell blood in the water, they might wait to see which side gains the upper hand." Tyene's eyes flicked over the reports. "Some say the Tyrells are growing impatient with Cersei's rule. Margaery's position at court is tenuous, thanks to the Faith militant fiasco, though we hear conflicting stories of how that ended. In any case, the Tyrell lords are not so quick to pour coin into a war that might bankrupt them. They might offer token support, but it could be half-hearted." Oberyn exhaled. "We can use that. If they won't lend real strength to the Lannisters, it leaves Kevin with only the Western forces and the Freys to rely on. The Freys? Well, they have numbers but little discipline, and their name is despised in half the realm. With luck, we can force them into a ruinous campaign. If Brynden Tully breaks their vanguard, the rest might fall apart." Still, for all his confidence, Oberyn felt the weight of the coming struggle. War seldom spared the innocent. He thought of Illyria's plea that he not lose himself in vengeance. He reminded himself that this was about justice, about forging a realm that would no longer be cowed by Lannister tyranny. But a part of him still reveled in the prospect of a final confrontation. Let Cersei see that the Vipers of Dorne did not forget. Riverrun prepared for siege. Brynden stationed archers along the battlements, built up stores of grain and salted meats, and dug hidden trenches in the fields beyond the castle's approaches. Edmure organized the civilian populace who flocked to the castle walls for protection, instructing them where to shelter if a siege began. Winter had arrived in earnest, blanketing the land in drifts of snow and ice. The Red Fork sometimes froze along the edges, though the main current still ran swiftly. Then came the first reports of the Frey host. Dozens of mounted scouts roamed the area, wearing the twin towers of House Frey on their cloaks. Brynden ordered his own outriders to engage them in skirmishes, denying them easy information. Soon, a large Frey force, several thousand strong, lumbered south from the twins. They trudged through the winter roads, accompanied by supply wagons. Brynden knew Walder Frey would likely attempt a pincer strategy, linking with the Lannister host marching from the west. If those two forces converged, Riverrun would face a formidable siege. In a daring move, Brynden dispatched a portion of his cavalry, supported by Dornish skirmishers, to harass the Frey column. They struck at night, quick as serpents, setting fire to wagons, shooting horses, and vanishing into the darkness. A half-dozen times. They repeated such raids, whittling down the Frey's supplies and morale. One night, they managed to capture a Frey captain. Under questioning, he revealed that they had strict orders to link with Kevin Lannister near Fairmarket, after which they would march together against Riverrun. Brynden shared this intelligence with Edmure and Ser Miles Santagar. "We can't face both hosts in open battle," Brynden warned. "Even combined with the Riverlord's levies, we're outnumbered. Our best chance is to prevent that link-up from happening, or to force them to fight us on ground of our choosing, where their numbers mean less. If we can break one host before it unites with the other, we stand a chance." Edmure agreed. "We can try to lure the Freys into an ambush near the Red Forks ford. It's narrow, and in this weather, the waters are dangerous. If we hold the opposite bank, they'll have to cross under fire. Then, if the Lannisters are late or delayed, the Freys could be forced to retreat or be destroyed before the Lannisters arrive." Ser Miles nodded but cautioned, "It will take cunning. We must not commit too many men. If the Lannisters arrive in time to flank us, we risk annihilation. Yet if we don't commit enough, the Freys might break through." Brynden permitted himself a tight smile. "Leave that to me. I've lived on these rivers all my life. The Freys have too, but they're used to crossing at the twins. They're out of their element here. Days later, the Tully-Dornish coalition set their trap. They positioned archers in the thick woods on the eastern bank of the Red Fork. Spearmen and pikemen waited behind a ridge, while a small force was placed on a low hill farther south to guard the flank. Brynden had guessed that the Freys would try to cross at a certain shallow ford near a ruined mill. The ground on the western side was relatively open, forcing the Freys to funnel through a narrow approach if they wanted to avoid bogs and thick underbrush. The morning of the battle dawned gray and cold, a light snow drifting from the steely sky. Brynden took position with Edmure, while Ser Miles commanded a separate contingent of Dornish fighters further along the line. From their vantage point, the Tully lords could see the Frey banners approaching in the distance. The column looked disorganized, weary from constant raids, but still formidable in numbers. A horn sounded from the Frey side. Scouts moved forward cautiously, testing the ford. At first, the Tully archers remained hidden, letting the Freys believe the crossing might be unguarded. Then, once the vanguard was waist-deep in the freezing water, Brynden raised his hand. A volley of arrows hissed through the air, cutting down the front line. Shouts and splashes followed. The Freys tried to form a shield wall midstream, but panic spread as more arrows rained down. The ice-crusted banks made footing treacherous, and men slipped under the current, weighed by armor. From the Frey rear, captains yelled for them to push forward or pull back. Confusion reigned. The Tully spearmen, lying in wait behind the ridge, suddenly charged down and attacked the Freys, who managed to stagger onto the eastern bank. Another volley of arrows sang out from the trees, and the crossing became a scene of chaos and blood. Bodies littered the ford, drifting downstream. Horses screamed, tangled in the shallows. Brynden observed from a small rise. He noticed the Frey center faltering, but on their right flank, a group of mounted knights was forging a path around the shallowest part of the ford. If enough of them crossed and formed up on the eastern bank, they could threaten the Tully archers. He sent a runner to Ser Miles Santagar, who signaled his Dornish warriors to move in. Lightly armored and quick, the Dornish fighters swept around to engage the Frey knights, using spears and shortbows to confound the heavier cavalry. The clash was brutal, but the Frey knights found themselves pinned between the lethal arrow fire from the woods and the Dornish footmen pressing in from the flank. The knights' charge stalled, and more riders were unhorsed, tumbling into the water. Some drowned in their armor, while others tried to scramble away only to be cut down. With the crossing in disarray, the Frey column began to retreat. A horn blast sounded from their rear, presumably a signal to regroup. But that retreat devolved into rout when Tully cavalry, hidden in a nearby copse, charged their flank. The Freys panicked, flinging down shields as they fled west. Brynden let them go, satisfied that the day was won. He did not have the numbers to chase them down too far, nor did he wish to push his luck. Instead, he ordered a withdrawal once the Freys had broken off. Tending to the wounded took time. Men groaned in the cold mud, limbs pierced by arrows or crushed by hooves. The Tully forces had lost some good soldiers, but the Freys suffered far worse. Brynden gave instructions to gather the prisoners. Among them was a minor Frey cousin, who raved about how his father would wreak vengeance. Brynden only shook his head grimly. Edmure approached, splattered with mud, a smear of dried blood on his cheek. "We did it," he said quietly, in disbelief. "We broke them." "That we did," Brynden replied, though his eyes were distant. "But they'll return, and next time, they might have Lannister steel at their back. We must not grow complacent." Ser Miles joined them, leaning on a spear. "We've bought time, and we've shown the realm that the Tullys can stand up to the Freys. Morale will soar." The men exchanged looks. Though the victory was real, the weight of the next battle already loomed. Still, that evening, the Tully-Dornish camp managed a modest celebration. Soldiers sang songs around the fires, passing wineskins of Dornish red. A hush fell when, in a moment of solemnity, Brynden offered a toast to all those who had fallen, on both sides, for the ambitions of their lords. He reminded them that they fought for justice, not cruelty, and that the small folks' hope rested on their success. When word of the defeat at the ford reached the Frey leadership, they were enraged. The battered remnants of their host limped back to Fairmarket, hoping to meet the Lannisters there. But as ill luck would have it for them, Kevan Lannister's forces were delayed by heavy snows and difficulties in mustering enough provisions for a winter campaign. By the time Kevan's banners finally appeared, the Frey host was demoralized and out of supplies. In a tense war council, Kevan chastised the Frey commanders for recklessness, but he also offered them a chance to regroup under the Lannister banner for a renewed push. Yet Kevan was no fool. He realized that pressing an attack on Riverrun in the dead of winter, after a significant defeat, was a risk. He decided to fortify a line near Fairmarket, establish supply caches, and bide his time until better weather or additional forces arrived. If that meant letting the Tully sit in Riverrun for a few more months, so be it. Once the roads cleared of snow, the Lannisters would come in strength. Back at Riverrun, winter clamped down with bitter ferocity. Snow piled high, and the swirling winds made travel nearly impossible. The Tully-Dornish alliance used the lull to strengthen the castle's fortifications and continue forging political ties. More lords trickled in, some with a handful of knights, others with small levies. The victory at the ford became a symbol of defiance. The small folk told tales of Brynden the Blackfish leading a cunning ambush, aided by the fierce Dornish spears. Everywhere, the name of House Frey was cursed for its treachery at the Red Wedding, and House Tully's revival was hailed as a long-overdue reckoning. Ravens arrived from Sunspear bearing Oberyn's messages of congratulations and reminders to remain vigilant. One letter included cautious optimism. The Stormlands showed signs of unrest, with certain lords quietly praising House Tully's stand. Another rumor suggested that a Targaryen heir, Daenerys, mother of dragons, had crossed the narrow sea and might lay claim to the Iron Throne. If that transpired, Oberyn speculated, it could throw the entire realm into chaos once again. But chaos might be an ally if it further eroded the Lannisters' power. In that cold stretch of time, Edmure Tully often found himself wandering the halls of Riverrun by torchlight, feeling the weight of leadership. He missed his sister, Catelyn, and often wondered what she would think of these events. Would she have approved of an alliance with Oberyn Martell? Likely, she would have done whatever it took to see the men who orchestrated the Red Wedding punished. Still, Edmure felt guilty for the times he had failed her and Robb. Now, he had a chance to redeem himself to restore the honor of House Tully. Brynden too carried ghosts of the past, but he threw himself into the tasks of commanding men and planning strategies, seldom giving voice to his regrets. He was thankful for the Dornish presence. Ser Miles Santagar and his captains brought discipline and a certain ferocity that contrasted with the more conventional chivalry of the River Lords. The combination of styles gave them an edge. When spring finally threatened to break winter's hold, Kevan Lannister made his move. Reinforced by fresh levies from the west, along with a contingent of House Frey men who had recovered from their earlier defeat, Kevan marched southeast with several thousand troops. According to Brynden's scouts, the Lannister host was formidable, certainly more disciplined than the Freys alone. The Tully-Dornish alliance would be outnumbered if they faced them directly. Brynden and Edmure consulted urgently with their allies. They could try to hold Riverrun against a full siege, trusting that Kevan Lannister might eventually be forced to withdraw due to supply problems. Or they could attempt another ambush strategy, though Kevan was more cautious than the Freys had been and unlikely to be trapped so easily. The decision weighed heavily. In the end, they settled on a mixed approach. Most of the Tully forces would remain in Riverrun, prepared to endure a siege, while a smaller, more mobile force of Dornish and Tully cavalry would continue to harass the Lannister supply lines. If Kevan tried to starve them out, he would face constant raids and sabotage, making it difficult to maintain a siege for long. And if Kevan attempted an assault, the castle's defenses, bolstered by months of preparation, would bleed him. Thus began a tense campaign of maneuver and feint. The Lannisters established a siege camp near Riverrun, but it was far from a complete encirclement, thanks to the swirling rivers and the winter-thawed mud that bogged down large troop movements. Brynden sent out sorties at night, burning tents and slaying sentries. The River Lords knew every hidden path and were adept at sneaking past enemy lines. Moreover, Oberyn funneled additional coin and goods through hidden routes in the Stormlands, ensuring the Tully defenders remained supplied. Inside King's Landing, Cersei grew restless for news of a decisive victory. She had pinned her hopes on Kevan quashing the Tully rebellion swiftly. But as moons passed with no final triumph, her temper frayed. The Tyrells, for their part, seemed in no hurry to commit large forces to a campaign that might benefit only House Lannister and the Freys. Cersei found herself undermined at every turn by petty court intrigues, Marjorie's popularity, and the weight of royal debt. At last, a day arrived when Kevan Lannister decided that an all-out assault on Riverrun might be less costly than a prolonged siege. He ordered his forces to prepare for a multi-pronged attack at dawn. The plan: a main thrust at the eastern curtain wall, supported by siege towers, while a secondary force tried to breach the western gate. Frey troops would screen the southwestern approach, cutting off Tully's sally ports. Kevan hoped that the Tully defenders, outnumbered, would buckle under simultaneous pressure. As the sky lightened to a pale gray, horns echoed across the fields. Lannister and Frey banners advanced, siege towers rolling forward through the mud. Archers loosed arrows at the battlements, while Tully archers responded in kind. The whir of bowstrings and the screams of the wounded filled the air. Men heaved and strained to push the towers forward, their shields raised against a deadly hail of arrows and scorching pitch. On the walls, Brynden Tully moved from position to position, shouting encouragement. Edmure manned the western gate with a reserve force. Dornish captains led smaller units that darted along the ramparts, flinging spears down or dropping pots of burning oil. The defenders had prepared cunning traps. Hidden pits outside certain stretches of the walls, which caused entire sections of the Lannister line to collapse into muck, giving easy targets for Tully bowmen. The first siege tower reached the eastern wall. Amid a cacophony of war cries and battered shields, a drawbridge slammed down onto the parapets. Lannister men-at-arms poured out, trying to establish a foothold. A savage melee erupted. Swords rang on steel, axes chopped into flesh. Brynden himself led a counterattack, driving the invaders back. Blood slicked the stones. The Red Fork, swirling nearby, seemed to run darker that day, as though reflecting the violence. Meanwhile, on the western side, Frey troops attempted to ram the gate. Edmure had placed boiling water cauldrons and archers above, unleashing a torrent of death on the rammers. Men screamed as scalding water cascaded over them, followed by arrows that pierced their chainmail. The gate shuddered under heavy blows, but it held firm. For hours, the battle seesawed along the walls. Kevan Lannister committed more reserves, determined to break through. Some of his men scaled ladders only to be hacked down or kicked off. The Tully defenders took heavy losses but refused to yield. Shouts of Tully and Dorne mixed with the roars of Castamere and Frey as the swirling chaos churned on. Ser Miles Santagar distinguished himself that day, rallying Dornish spearmen to repel a breach in the northern stretch of the battlements. When a group of Lannister soldiers gained the wall, Ser Miles led a countercharge, his spear flashing with lethal precision. Brynden, fighting nearby, could not help but admire the man's skill. The Dornish alliance proved its worth. By late afternoon, it became clear that Kevan Lannister's offensive was stalled. Each attempt to secure the walls had been repulsed, and with every passing hour, the attackers lost more men. The siege towers were in flames or stuck in muddy pits. The Frey soldiers, less disciplined and already battered, began to waver. Kevan Lannister had to decide whether to press the attack and risk catastrophic losses or call a retreat and maintain a siege. He chose caution. Trumpets sounded the withdrawal, and the Lannister Frey host fell back, dragging the wounded with them if they could. The defenders on the walls cheered raggedly, though the cost was steep. Bodies lay piled where the fighting had been fiercest. Tully banners dripped with blood, and the stench of death mingled with the acrid smell of charred wood. That night, Brynden and Edmure walked the ramparts, overseeing the collection of the dead and the distribution of meager rations to the living. They found Ser Miles Santagar, slumped on a stool near a brazier, an arrow lodged in his thigh. A Dornish medic worked to extract it, The knight grimaced in pain but managed a tired grin. "We held, my lords," he said, voice strained. "Prince Oberyn will be pleased if I live to tell him." "You'll live," Brynden said, clapping him on the shoulder gently. "We owe you much. Get some rest." Edmure gazed out at the dark fields. Torches flickered in the distance, marking the Lannister camp. "They won't give up after one failure," he muttered. "Kevin is too pragmatic to keep throwing men at the walls. He'll just tighten the siege. It could last for moons." Brynden pressed his lips together. "We'll hold as long as we can, and if Oberyn can move more allies to our cause, perhaps we can force Kevin to deal or retreat. One thing is certain, the Lannisters have lost their veneer of invincibility. We stood against them, and we did not break." Word of the battle's outcome raced across the realm. In the Stormlands, lords who once hesitated began to lean more favorably toward the Tully-Martell axis. Some openly declared that if House Tully could stand up to the Lannisters in phrase, then perhaps the time was ripe to challenge the crown's authority. Grievances of high taxes and broken promises flowed freely. The crown, after all, was heavily in debt. In the Reach, the Tyrell court quietly noted that Cersei's forces had met a stalemate at Riverrun. Margaery Tyrell, now aware that the Queen Regent's power was not absolute, employed subtle tactics at court to undermine Lannister influence. While no open break occurred, Cersei found herself increasingly isolated. From across the sea came tales of Daenerys Targaryen forging alliances and conquering cities, though how that would impact Westeros remained uncertain. For now, the key conflict was between the crown, propped up by the Lannisters and Freys, and the surprising union of Tully and Martell, kept alive by Dornish gold and Tully tenacity. Oberyn Martell sensed that the moment of truth drew near. If Kevin Lannister persisted in a drawn-out siege, it might strain Lannister resources. Perhaps that would force Cersei to negotiate or even prompt a coup within the Lannister ranks. But Oberyn was not one to wait passively. He sent fresh instructions to his captains, urging them to prepare for a bold stroke, an attack on the Frey seat itself if the opportunity arose. Striking the twins would be risky, but if House Frey was forced to defend its home, the noose around Riverrun might loosen. Plans took shape in secret. Dornish ships slipped into the narrow sea, ferrying more men who landed near the coast and passed through the rebellious Stormlands. Little by little, Oberyn constructed the scaffolding for a grand move, never losing sight of his ultimate goal, to shatter Lannister power. All through the realms, lesser lords waited with bated breath, unsure which side would emerge victorious. The Tully banner flying over Riverrun served as a beacon of hope for those who had suffered under Lannister rule. The crowned stag of Baratheon was absent, Tommen being but a figurehead under the lion's paw. The direwolf of Stark was believed extinct or scattered in the far north. The dragon of Targaryen hovered beyond the seas. Thus, it was the leaping trout of Tully and the sun and spear of Martell that now lit the fires of resistance across the southern half of Westeros. Yet for every hope, there was fear. War meant more blood, more starvation, more chaos for the common folk. At night, villagers along the Trident whispered half-prayers for peace, even as they cursed House Frey. They gathered inside huts while wolves howled in the winter dark, never sure if the next day would bring a new battle to their doorstep. One night, a lightly wounded Kevin Lannister rode under flag of truce to speak with Brynden Tully before the walls of Riverrun. They met on a narrow stretch of ground between the lines, a place pocked with old arrow holes and splattered with dry blood from the siege attempt. A handful of men from both sides stood guard at a respectful distance. "You are a stubborn man, Ser Brynden," Kevin said in a quiet, resigned tone. "Tywin always said so. He admired your skill and nerve, even if it vexed him." Brynden kept his expression neutral. "Your nephew helped orchestrate the Red Wedding," he said. "Now House Frey and House Lannister have the audacity to hold the throne. Did you think the rest of us would simply forget?" Kevin sighed. "I understand your anger, but the realm cannot endure another war. Surely there is a path to peace, some arrangement. Name your terms. My niece, the Queen Regent, might be convinced to grant them, if they are not too exorbitant." Brynden's lips thinned. Oberyn Martell would demand nothing less than justice for Elia. We Tullys demand justice for the murder of Catelyn Tully and Robb Stark. Justice means punishing the Freys, removing them from the lordship they stole. Justice means the Lannisters relinquish their stranglehold on the throne. Are you prepared to discuss that? Kevin looked pained. I cannot. Cersei would never yield the throne, nor would Walder Frey surrender his lands. You must know how impossible that is. Then we have no peace, Brynden said flatly. Let the siege continue. Kevin studied him, then nodded once, his shoulders heavy. Without another word, he turned his horse and rode back to the Lannister lines. So the stalemate endured. The siege tightened, but not enough to choke Riverrun. The Tully Dornish raiders kept harassing Lannister supply routes, ensuring that Kevin's men teetered on the edge of hunger themselves. Clouds of ravens circled the battlefield each day, feasting on the dead. In the midst of this grim war, Oberyn Martell embarked on his bold plan to strike at the twins. Coordinating with Brynden and Edmure through coded messages, he arranged for a swift-moving force, some from Dorne, some from the Stormlands who had declared for the rebellion, to march up the eastern roads toward the Trident. Their path was treacherous, for they risked crossing lands still under Crown or Frey control, but their aim was to catch the Freys off guard. If the twins came under direct threat, Walder Frey might recall troops from the siege lines, weakening Kevin's campaign. When Walder Frey learned that an army threatened his seat, he flew into one of his infamous rages, shrieking for his sons to defend him. But many of his best men were pinned at Riverrun. The old man demanded reinforcements from Kevin Lannister, but Kevin could not spare many soldiers either, for he was locked in a precarious siege. Reluctantly, Walder Frey recalled a portion of his own host, reducing the number of men around Riverrun. That partial withdrawal relieved pressure on the castle. Edmure, though grateful, worried that if the strike against the twins failed, the Freys might swiftly return. But Oberyn's plan had more cunning layers. He had convinced certain renegade lords around Harrenhal to provide safe passage for the rebel force, ensuring they could approach the twins from multiple angles. As the Freys scrambled to defend their great crossing, the Tully Dornish coalition gained even more ground in the Riverlands. Weeks later, a rider galloped into the siege camp with dire news for Walder Frey's kin. The rebel force had taken some smaller Frey holdings north of the twins. The monstrous fortress of the twins itself was not yet under siege, but Walder's vassals were deserting, and local peasants were rising against him. Chaos engulfed the Frey lands. That, at last, forced a major contingent of Frey soldiers to abandon the siege of Riverrun entirely and race back north. Kevin Lannister could only watch in dismay as part of his allied forces departed. With their numbers diminished, the siege lines grew thin. Brynden seized that chance, sending out more sorties, capturing outlying positions. Soon the Lannister host found itself harried and outmaneuvered. Kevin, unwilling to let his army be picked apart, decided on a retreat to Harrenhal, where he could regroup. Riverrun remained in Tully hands, triumphant. Inside the castle walls, cheers erupted when the Lannister banners pulled back. Men embraced, battered and exhausted but alive. Brynden immediately sent word to Oberyn Martell, proclaiming the success of their strategy. The Cross-Realm Alliance had forced the Freys to defend their stronghold, thus lifting the siege. Oberyn's gamble had worked. For the moment, it seemed the Tullys and Martells had the upper hand. Riverrun stood unconquered. The twins were under threat, and Lannister might was in retreat. The realm watched with widened eyes as the once invincible lion bled from a dozen wounds. In King's Landing, Cersei raged at the news, lashing out at courtiers and threatening to arrest any who dared speak of the crown's weakness. She summoned the small council, demanded new measures of taxation, and even considered calling upon the Tyrells more directly, but that would only deepen the crown's debt to them. Meanwhile, the realm's old wounds remained open. The North was still embroiled in its own struggles. The Vale hovered in uncertain neutrality under Littlefinger's machinations. The Iron Islands seethed with their own leadership crises. Daenerys Targaryen's name flitted about in whispered rumors. In all of this, Oberyn Martell stood as the quiet architect of a rebellion that had humbled the Lannisters more effectively than any army had done since Robb Stark's early victories. But unlike Robb, the Tully-Martell alliance did not rely on a single hot-headed king. They relied on cunning, gold, and a web of smaller alliances that chipped away at the Lion's power. As spring warmed into a tentative summer, delegations from the Vale and the Reach began making discreet inquiries. Could they reach terms with House Tully and House Martell? What future did they envision for the Iron Throne if Tommen's claim was undermined? Edmure found himself, for the first time in his life, plunged into the deep end of political negotiation. Brynden guided him, but Edmure had to find the confidence to speak as a lord among equals. He discovered, to his own surprise, that the adversity he had faced had toughened him. He no longer stammered or hesitated when lords questioned Tully's intentions. In Sunspear, Oberyn met often with Prince Doran behind closed doors. Doran, still deliberate and measured, cautioned his brother that a wounded lion might still lash out lethally. Oberyn agreed but insisted the moment was ripe to press the advantage. Elia's memory, the thirst for justice, drove him onward. He believed that if they dealt a final blow to the Freys, perhaps by capturing the twins, they could break House Frey for good, freeing the Riverlands to stand wholly with the Tully cause. Then, with a stable homeland and the might of Dorne, they could force the Lannisters to surrender in King's Landing or face open revolution by half the realm. As that grand plan took shape, the rebellious force near the twins intensified their operations. They burned Frey granaries, freed captives, and rallied local folk who despised the Freys for their cruel lordship. Walder Frey's many heirs bickered among themselves about how to respond. Some wanted to defend the twins at all costs, while others wanted to ride out and crush the upstarts. The old man, half mad with fury, refused to entertain any notion of parley. So the tension escalated, with skirmishes erupting around the network of roads leading to the twins. At last, Walder Frey seemed to sense the precariousness of his position. He had lost the siege at Riverrun, his outer holdings were under attack, and even Kevan Lannister had pulled his forces back to Harrenhal. In desperation, he sent ravens to King's Landing and to the Westerlands, pleading for immediate assistance. But the Lannisters were stretched thin, the realm in disarray. Cersei still refused to see the danger in anything but personal terms. Kevan, though more realistic, was forced to consolidate lest his battered host be destroyed in detail. Thus, House Frey found itself largely alone as the rebels closed in. One fateful dawn, the small rebel army, numbering perhaps 2,000 men, including Stormland Knights, Dornish mercenaries, and outriders from the Riverlands, approached the fortified crossing of the Twins. The fortress, with its two identical towers looming over the Green Fork, looked as daunting as ever. A frontal assault would be suicide, but this time, the rebel leaders had a plan gleaned from local informants. There was an ancient tunnel near one bank, half collapsed, which might grant a small force access beneath the eastern tower. Under covering darkness, a group of daring volunteers slipped into the tunnel, guided by old smugglers who knew the muddy labyrinth. They slogged through waist-deep water, feeling their way by torchlight. Any alarm would doom them, but luck was with them. The Frey guards above never suspected an infiltration. After hours of inching through the foul-smelling passage, the rebels emerged inside the dungeons of the eastern tower. They took the guards there by surprise, dispatching them silently. Once inside, the infiltration force spread out. Some raced to the gatehouse machinery, determined to open the massive gates that controlled the fortified bridge between the two towers. Others made for the main halls, hoping to sow confusion. Alarms began to ring, shouts echoing through the corridors. But the rebels had gained a crucial foothold. Outside, as dawn broke, the rest of the rebel army surged forward, crossing a narrow strip of land near the walls. Archers rained arrows on the parapets, forcing the Frey defenders to duck. Then, with a groan and a clang, the heavy gates swung open, a sign that the infiltration had succeeded in capturing the gatehouse. The attackers rushed in, flooding the eastern tower. Fierce fighting erupted in the cramped hallways and stairwells. Frey men-at-arms tried to mount a defense, but many, demoralized by recent defeats, broke quickly. Walder Frey himself barricaded the main hall of the Western Tower, cursing and snarling. He refused to surrender, though chaos reigned around him. Some of his sons dragged him away, fearing for his safety, but the old man raged that he would not flee. Still, the tide was unstoppable. As the Eastern Tower fell, more rebels poured across the bridge to assault the Western Tower. Eventually, the Freys found themselves cornered, battered by overwhelming numbers. The fortress that had stood for centuries fell in a matter of hours. Whether Walder Frey survived that final battle or perished in the fray is a matter of rumor and conflicting accounts. Some say he was dragged away by a handful of loyal sons, escaping into the countryside. Others claim that, in the chaos, a vengeful soldier recognized him and slit his throat. In any case, the rule of the twins by Walder Frey ended. By midday, the rebel banner, one half Tully trout, half sun and spear, or sometimes the Baratheon stag of the Stormlords who had joined, flew over the ramparts. In Riverrun, Brynden received the news with grim satisfaction. House Frey, the conspirator of the Red Wedding, was broken. The hold they had on the Riverlands was shattered, their seat taken, their forces decimated. It was a triumphant moment of long-delayed justice for Catelyn Tully and Robb Stark, whose spilled blood still haunted the Trident. When Oberyn learned of the twins' capture, he allowed himself a small, triumphant smile. One piece of the Lannister Frey power structure had collapsed. Now the door stood open for the next step, dealing with the Lannisters themselves. With Frey dominion ended, the Riverlands and Dorne stood united, a swath of Westeros that might soon include allies from the Stormlands, and possibly even from the Vale or the Reach. Against such an alliance, Cersei's hold on King's Landing became tenuous. Letters soon poured in from nervous lords across the Crownlands. Many had no love for the Lannisters, yet they feared what a full-scale assault on the capital might bring. Blood in the streets, possibly, or another sacking of King's Landing, reminiscent of the day the Lannisters had turned on the Mad King. The irony was not lost on Oberyn or the Tullys. They might now be poised to do what Tywin Lannister had once done: march on the city with a host and topple the ruling regime. Still, the question remained: who would wear the crown afterward? Brynden Tully had no wish to be king. Neither did Oberyn Martell. Some whispered that if a Targaryen claimant returned, the Martells and Tullys might throw their support behind a revived Targaryen dynasty. Others proposed that the Stormlands might enthrone a Baratheon pretender once more. Even the idea of an independent Dorne or an independent North floated through the rumor mills. But for the moment, the prime objective bound them: remove the Lannisters from absolute power, punish them for their crimes, and break the cycle of terror that Tywin had wielded. As summer's warmth spread over a land still reeling from war, negotiations and secret deals flourished. The Tullys secured the loyalty of nearly every riverlord, with the Frey's downfall rallying the final holdouts. Dorne's infiltration across the Stormlands and even into the Crownlands increased, with gold smoothing the way for deals. More and more, Cersei Lannister found her support eroding. She raged in the Red Keep, alienating allies, and her once loyal advisors began to doubt her. Kevan Lannister, disheartened by the fiasco at Riverrun, reportedly tried to salvage the situation with diplomacy, but Cersei rebuffed him. Then came the final blow. The Vale, through certain lords who disliked Peter Baelish's manipulations, sent an envoy to the Tullys, expressing readiness to support a move against the crown if the terms were acceptable. That changed everything. With the Vale's knights and the Riverlands forces combined, Dorne's gold, and a likely alliance with some of the Stormlands, the capital could be surrounded and cut off from the breadbasket of the Reach, especially if the Tyrells chose neutrality or subtle sabotage. In the height of that tense summer, Oberyn Martell at last left Sunspear, traveling with a contingent of Dornish spears to join the newly formed alliance in the Riverlands. He arrived at Riverrun to a rapturous welcome, not just from his own men but also from Tully soldiers who had learned to admire the Dornish. Brynden and Edmure Tully received him in the courtyard, banners snapping overhead. Oberyn approached on horseback, dressed in fine Dornish leathers, a spear strapped behind him. He dismounted gracefully. Brynden came forward to clasp his arm, Edmure bowed slightly. Prince Oberyn, Brynden said, voice resonant with respect. House Tully owes you a debt we can never repay. Elia Martell's memory has fueled your quest for justice, and we share that quest for Caitlin and Robb. Oberyn's dark eyes gleamed. Together, we have brought down House Frey, he said. Soon, we shall deal the final blow to House Lannister. For Elia, for your kin, for all the innocent lives taken by Lannister treachery. A hush descended on the courtyard as soldiers gathered around, eager to glimpse the legendary Red Viper. Oberyn paused, then spoke in a resonant voice. My friends, I stand before you not as a prince of Dorne alone, but as an ally to the Riverlands. Our union has shaken the pillars of tyranny. If we continue to stand as one, no lion can devour us. And if the realm sees that houses once distant, Tully and Martell, can unite for justice, perhaps we can end the cycle of bloodshed and fear. A cheer erupted, the sound echoing off the castle walls. Brynden could not help but grin. He saw in Oberyn a man who, like himself, had lost so much to the Lannisters' cruelty, yet had refused to let that break him. They were kindred spirits, in a way. That very evening, a war council convened in Riverrun's great hall, lit by many torches. Around a large table, the principal leaders gathered: Oberyn Martell, Brynden Tully, Edmure Tully, Ser Miles Santagar, and various lords representing the Vale, the Riverlands, Dorne, and the Stormlands. They pored over maps of the Crownlands, the roads leading to King's Landing, and the potential strategies for dethroning Cersei Lannister. Some suggested a direct march on the capital. Others advised caution, pointing out that the city's walls and the royal fleet still posed a serious obstacle. The Gold Cloaks might remain loyal, or they might turn if the siege dragged on. The Tyrells could intervene. There were 100 moving pieces, yet the momentum was theirs. In that hushed circle of conspirators, Oberyn Martell laid out a vision of how they might proceed. Seize key roads, isolate King's Landing from food supplies, and force Cersei to negotiate or surrender before the city starved. If she refused, they could attempt a final assault. But Oberyn advocated caution in order to spare innocent lives in the capital. He wanted to punish the Lannisters, not butcher the common folk. Brynden nodded, taking all suggestions into account. We must also be mindful that Cersei is cunning in her own right. If she suspects we plan to starve King's Landing, she might lash out in desperation, perhaps threatening to burn the city or use vile means to hold on to power. We need to be ready for anything. That night, as the council ended, Oberyn lingered behind with Brynden and Edmure. The three men shared a quiet moment in the empty hall, the torches guttering. Oberyn gazed at the Tully banner, then at the Martell sigil side by side on the stone wall. When this is done, Oberyn murmured, we will have changed the course of the Seven Kingdoms. If the Lannisters are toppled, a new future can be born. My brother once hoped to seat Dorne alongside the rest of the realm as an equal, not a subject. Perhaps that can still happen. Edmure, still young enough to embrace idealism, said, we can build a realm founded on trust, not fear, if we are wise. Brynden gave a low, thoughtful grunt. I've seen enough war to know that talk of a better realm often dies on the battlefield. But we can try. That alone is better than what the Lannisters offered. They parted ways, each lost in his own thoughts. Outside, the moon glittered on the Red Fork, a silent witness to the swirling tides of power. The war for vengeance and justice had already shattered one great house, Frey, and now threatened another, Lannister. Yet beyond the horizon, other dangers brewed. Targaryen dragons, northern wars, and the quiet, unrelenting approach of winter's deeper chill. Still, for this fleeting moment, the alliance between Oberyn Martell and House Tully burned bright as a newly risen star in the night sky. They had accomplished the impossible, forging bonds that defied centuries of distance between Dorne and the Riverlands. They stood on the threshold of toppling the Lannisters, avenging Elia Martell, Robb Stark, and Caitlin Tully all at once. The Red Viper had not sought a crown. He had sought retribution and a chance to shape a freer, fairer Westeros. And the Tully trout, battered by betrayal, found new purpose in forging a path that might restore honor to the realm. In time, bards would sing of how a viper and a fish swam the same waters, luring the lion to a watery grave, how the once omnipotent Lannister name was brought low by those it had wronged, and how Walder Frey reaped the whirlwind he had sown. Whether the final blow fell within the walls of King's Landing or beyond, the realm would never be the same. For now, though with steel in their hands and hope in their hearts, they prepared for the final act of this grand drama, a reckoning that would echo through the halls of power for generations to come. And in the stillness of the Riverrun night, Oberyn Martell stood alone on a rampart, gazing at the reflection of the moon on the water. He closed his eyes, remembering Elia, her gentle voice, her warm smile. In the soft breeze, he almost heard her purr as though she stood by his side, urging him onward. He opened his eyes, a faint, bittersweet smile on his lips. This time, the red viper would not fall. This time, he was not alone, and he was determined to see justice done. The roar of the lion was fading into the distance, and soon Oberyn hoped the cry of the viper and the triumph of the trout would echo across the seven kingdoms. Justice, vengeance, and a new beginning beckoned on the horizon.